Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might actually put you to sleep, but not in the way you'd expect. We're diving into the brutal, bloody, and surprisingly boring reality of first century Roman Christianity. The kind of faith that would make your Sunday morning service look like a luxury spa retreat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You think modern church is boring? You think sitting through a 2-hour sermon is tough? Well, congratulations, because you've just volunteered for a spiritual endurance test that would make Navy SEAL training look like nap time. Welcome to the first century Roman Church, where worship wasn't a Sunday morning obligation, it was a life or death commitment that could literally get you fed to lions before lunch. Picture this, it's 67 CE. You're a new convert in Rome, and someone just invited you to a Christian gathering. Sounds peaceful, right? Wrong. You're about to enter a world where prayer meetings happen in sewers, communion involves actual life-threatening risk, and your pastor might be crucified by Thursday. This isn't your grandmother's church potluck. This is underground resistance disguised as worship, and frankly, you're not ready for it. Let's start with the basics. Location, location, location. You're not meeting in a beautiful cathedral with stained glass windows and cushioned pews. You're meeting in Marcus's basement, assuming Marcus hasn't been arrested yet. The room smells like olive oil, unwashed bodies, and fear. There are no hymnals because most people can't read. There's no organ because musical instruments would attract the neighbours. And the neighbours, well, they're probably looking for reasons to turn you in for that sweet government reward money. The service starts at dawn, not because it's convenient, but because it's the only time the Roman authorities aren't actively hunting Christians. You sit on the floor. There are no chairs. Your back hurts within minutes, but complaining isn't really an option when the penalty for being here is death by public execution. Now, about that communion you've heard so much about. Forget the tiny wafer and grape juice. This is a full meal, and it's chaos. Everyone brings what they can. The wealthy bring bread and wine. The poor bring hope and empty stomachs. The slaves bring whatever they could sneak out of their master's kitchen without getting flogged. And everyone shares everything. It's beautiful in theory. In practice, it's 30 people trying to divide 2 loaves of bread and a jug of wine that tastes like it's been stored in someone's sandal. But here's where it gets interesting. The Romans think you're cannibals. Seriously, they hear Christians talking about eating the body and drinking the blood of their God. And they assume you're having ritual human sacrifice dinners. So, not only are you risking arrest for illegal assembly, you're also dodging accusations of cannibalism. Sunday mornings just got a lot more complicated. The prayers last forever. And when I say forever, I mean your knees are going numb, your stomach is growling, and you're starting to wonder if eternal salvation is worth this level of physical discomfort. The pastor, if you can call him that, doesn't have a seminary degree. He's probably a fisherman or a tent maker who had a vision and decided to risk his life spreading the word. His sermon isn't polished, it's passionate, desperate, and occasionally interrupted by someone running in to warn that Roman soldiers are searching houses 3 blocks away. Speaking of interruptions, let's talk about the constant threat of discovery. Every creak in the floorboards above makes everyone freeze. Every footstep in the alley outside sends hands to hidden weapons. Yes, weapons. Turn the other cheek is a beautiful philosophy, but when the alternative is watching your children get torn apart by wild animals in the Colosseum, some Christians decided that maybe Jesus would understand a little self-defense. The music, if you can call it that, is whispered hymns and nervous humming. No choir robes, no professional soloists, just scared people trying to find comfort in melody while listening for the sound of military boots on cobblestones. The acoustics are terrible. The The basement echoes with a weird dampness that makes everything sound like it's coming from underwater. And then there's the baptism situation. You can't exactly book the church pool for next Sunday. Baptisms happen in rivers, wells, or large basins filled with water that's probably been used for washing clothes earlier that day. It's cold, it's public, and it's risky. The social dynamics are unlike anything you've experienced. Slaves worship alongside their masters. Roman citizens pray next to foreign immigrants. Women speak in religious discussions, which is scandalous enough to get you arrested, even without the Christianity charges. The early church wasn't just religiously radical, it was socially revolutionary. They were dismantling the entire Roman social order, one prayer meeting at a time. But here's what would really drive you crazy. The boredom. Between the fear and the discomfort, there's mind-numbing repetition. The same prayers repeated for hours. The same stories told again and again, because there are no written gospels yet. Just oral traditions passed down through people who may or may not remember the details correctly. You'd hear the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, and someone would interrupt to argue whether it was 5,000 or 4,000, and suddenly you're in a theological debate that lasts until sunset. The women's situation deserves special mention. They're more involved in leadership than they'll be for the next 18 centuries, but they're also taking enormous risks. A woman caught at an illegal Christian gathering faced not just execution, but public humiliation, assault, and the destruction of her family's reputation. Yet they kept coming. They kept leading. They kept risking everything for a faith that promised them equality in the next life, while offering them persecution in this one. Food was always an issue, not just the communion meal, but actual survival. Christians were often cut off from trade guilds, which meant losing their jobs. They were ostracized from social networks, which meant losing customers. Many early Christian communities lived in poverty by choice and by force. That beautiful sharing of resources you read about in Acts wasn't just spiritual generosity. It was economic necessity. Share or starve. The children's experience was particularly harsh. They couldn't attend Roman schools because education was intertwined with pagan religious ceremonies. They couldn't participate in public festivals because festivals honored Roman gods. They grew up isolated, different, marked. Many never learned to read because Christian literacy wasn't a priority when survival was uncertain. Their childhood was spent learning to hide their faith, to lie convincingly to authorities, and to recognize the signs of impending persecution. Let's talk about the holidays, or rather, the complete lack thereof. No Christmas, no Easter celebrations as you know them. The only holy day that mattered was the weekly gathering, and even that was more memorial service than celebration. They commemorated Christ's death with the intensity of people who expected to join him soon. Every communion was potentially a Last Supper, every prayer possibly a final confession. The theological confusion was staggering. There was no New Testament yet, no official doctrine, no central authority. Different communities believed different things about Jesus, about salvation, about how to live a Christian life. Imagine trying to practice a religion where the rule book is still being written, the teachers disagree on fundamental points, and getting it wrong might cost you your eternal soul. The pressure was immense. And speaking of pressure, let's discuss the psychological toll. These weren't people who grew up in Christian families with centuries of tradition behind them. These were converts who had abandoned everything they knew. Former pagans who had worshipped Roman gods their entire lives, suddenly switching to a Jewish carpenter's teachings. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. They were essentially joining a cult, and they knew it. The persecution wasn't constant, but it was unpredictable. You might go months without incident, then wake up to find half your congregation in prison. The randomness was part of the torture. You never knew when someone would decide to report you, when a neighbor would get suspicious, when a former friend would trade your location for a few coins. Paranoia wasn't a mental illness. It was a survival skill. Medical care was non-existent. If you got sick during a gathering, you suffered in silence or left. There were no church nurses, no first aid kits, no understanding of hygiene. Diseases spread through congregations like wildfire. Many Christians died not from persecution, but from plagues that tore through their close-knit communities. They interpreted illness as either divine testing or demonic attack, neither of which offered much practical comfort. The gender dynamics were revolutionary and confusing. Women could prophesy and lead, but they also had to navigate Roman expectations of female behavior. Men had to balance Christian teachings about humility with Roman concepts of masculine honor. Everyone was improvising their way through a social revolution while trying not to get executed for treason. But perhaps the most exhausting part was the waiting. Christians believed Jesus would return in their lifetime. Every gathering might be the last before the second coming. Every persecution might herald the end times. They lived in constant anticipation of cosmic events that never materialized. Imagine spending your entire life on high alert, expecting the world to end any day, watching for signs and portents that never came. The psychological strain was devastating. The economic impact extended beyond job loss. Christians couldn't participate in most social activities because they involved pagan rituals. No public baths because they honored Roman gods. No theatre because plays celebrated pagan mythology. No gladiator games because they involved human sacrifice. They were essentially cut off from Roman society, creating a parallel economy of Christian merchants, Christian services, Christian everything. Marriage was complicated. Roman law didn't recognize Christian ceremonies. Christian ethics forbade divorce in most circumstances, but Roman culture expected it. Mixed marriages between Christians and pagans created impossible situations. Children born to these unions belonged to two incompatible worlds. The personal cost of conversion extended far beyond the individual believer. The intellectual isolation was crushing. Romans had libraries, schools, philosophical discussions, scientific inquiry. Christians had oral traditions, basic literacy at best, and a suspicion of worldly knowledge. Many converts went from sophisticated urban lifestyles to intellectual poverty overnight. The early church wasn't exactly encouraging critical thinking when survival depended on absolute faith. And through all of this, they kept gathering, week after week, in basements and caves and hidden rooms. They kept sharing their meager resources. They kept risking their lives for communion with people they'd known for months, not years. They kept believing that their suffering had meaning, that their sacrifice would matter, that their God would somehow make it all worthwhile. The irony is staggering. These people, meeting in sewers and praying in whispers, created a movement that would eventually conquer the very empire that was trying to destroy them. But they didn't know that. They thought they were joining a small, doomed sect that would probably disappear within a generation. They had no idea they were laying the foundation for a religion that would shape the next 2,000 years of human history. So the next time you complain about uncomfortable church pews or long sermons, remember the first century Christians. They sat on stone floors for hours, risked their lives for communion, and found ways to worship a God who seemed determined to test their faith with every breath they took. They didn't have the luxury of boredom. They had terror, discomfort, and the constant possibility of death. And yet, somehow, they kept the faith. Not because it was easy, but because they believed it was true. Not because it made their lives better, but because they thought it made their souls eternal. They endured because they had to, because they'd already lost everything else, because the alternative to hope was despair. You wouldn't last a day in a first-century Roman church. None of us would. We're too comfortable, too safe, too accustomed to religion as a social convenience, rather than a life or death commitment. But maybe that's the point. Maybe understanding their sacrifice helps us appreciate our freedom. Maybe remembering their courage inspires our own faith. Or maybe it just makes us grateful that modern Christianity comes with cushioned seats and climate control. Either way, those early believers earned their place in history the hard way, one terrifying prayer meeting at a time. But surviving the underground gatherings was only the beginning. Because if you thought hiding in Roman sewers while singing hymns was challenging, wait until you discovered what happened when the authorities actually found you. And they always found someone. The thing about being a first-century Christian wasn't just the constant fear of discovery. It was living with the knowledge that your faith had made you enemies you'd never even met. Roman officials who'd never heard your name were already planning your execution. Neighbors who'd shared meals with you were composing accusations. Even family members were calculating whether your arrest might improve their own standing with local magistrates. See, the Romans had a particular genius for bureaucratic persecution. They didn't need to hunt down every Christian individually. They simply made Christianity illegal and waited for circumstances to deliver victims. A business dispute gone wrong, a personal grudge, a property inheritance controversy. Any of these could suddenly become a religious tribunal. All someone had to do was whisper the word Christian to the right official, and your problems multiplied faster than loaves and fishes. The charges were always the same. Atheism, because Christians refused to worship Roman gods. Cannibalism, because communion sounded suspiciously like ritual consumption of human flesh. Incest, because Christians called each other brother and sister and met in secret. Treason, because they claimed allegiance to a king named Jesus rather than Caesar. And sedition, because they insisted their kingdom was not of this world, which Romans interpreted as plotting to overthrow this world. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who modern people quote on Instagram for inspiration, signed death warrants for Christians with the same detached intellectualism he applied to morning meditation. To him, Christians weren't martyrs. They were theatrical attention seekers disrupting the natural order of society. Their willingness to die for their beliefs wasn't noble. It was embarrassingly irrational. The trials themselves were perfunctory. Roman justice was efficient when it wanted to be. A magistrate would ask 3 questions. Are you a Christian? Will you offer sacrifice to the emperor? Will you curse Christ? Answer yes to the first and no to the others. And the sentence was immediate. No appeals, no lengthy deliberations, no last-minute pardons. Just a quick administrative stamp and a scheduled execution. But here's what made it truly terrifying. The Romans didn't just kill you. They made your death into entertainment. Public executions weren't grim necessities hidden away from civilized society. They were afternoon programming. Families brought picnic lunches. Children learned civic lessons. Vendors sold snacks and souvenirs. Christians were crucified, obviously, but that was almost merciful compared to the alternatives. They were burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's garden parties. They were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs. They were forced to fight gladiators while dressed as mythological figures, their deaths scripted like theatrical performances. The crowd didn't see suffering. They saw special effects. Polycarp, the 86-year-old bishop of Smyrna, was burned at the stake after refusing to renounce his faith. When the flames wouldn't take properly, they stabbed him with a sword. His last words weren't screams of agony. They were prayers of gratitude. The crowd, expecting spectacle, got a sermon instead. Some were horrified, others were converted. Most just wanted their money back. The psychological torture was often worse than the physical. Roman interrogators were skilled at finding pressure points. They'd arrest entire families, but only execute the father, leaving the widow and children to survive as social outcasts. They'd threatened to sell Christians into slavery in distant provinces where no one spoke their language. They'd promise freedom in exchange for the names of other believers, then execute the informants anyway for being traitors. Children posed a particular problem. Roman law technically protected minors, but Christian children were considered infected with a contagious superstition. Some were forcibly adopted by pagan families for re-education. Others were simply abandoned, left to survive as street orphans in cities that showed little mercy to the vulnerable. The lucky ones died quickly alongside their parents. Women faced additional horrors. Before execution, many were handed over to brothels as a form of preliminary punishment. The logic was twisted but consistent. If they claimed to follow a god of purity, let them be defiled first. Some chose suicide rather than submission. Others endured degradation and still refused to renounce their faith. Their resilience baffled Roman authorities, who couldn't understand what kind of religion produced such determination. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the cruelty itself, but the casual nature of it. Persecuting Christians wasn't a passionate campaign or a holy war. It was administrative housekeeping, filing reports, processing paperwork, maintaining order. Executions were scheduled between tax collection and road maintenance. Martyrdom was just another line item in the imperial budget. And yet somehow this systematic brutality backfired. Every public execution created more Christians than it eliminated. Spectators who came for entertainment left asking questions. Why would someone die for a crucified Jewish preacher? What did these people know that inspired such fearlessness? How could children face death with more composure than battle-hardened soldiers? The blood of martyrs really was the seed of the church, but not in some mystical sense. It was pure psychology. When people saw ordinary individuals choosing torture over compromise, it forced a reckoning. Either these Christians were delusional fanatics, or they possessed something worth dying for. And when faced with that choice, many Romans chose to investigate rather than dismiss. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, noted that the more Christians were cut down, the more they multiplied. Roman efficiency, applied to persecution, had created an unintended consequence. They turned execution into evangelism. But here's the part that would keep you awake at night if you were a 1st century believer. You never knew when your turn would come. The knock on the door could happen during dinner, during prayer, during sleep. Children learned to pack emergency bags. Wives memorized final messages for absent husbands. Everyone lived with the constant awareness that this conversation, this meal, this gathering might be their last. The psychological toll was immense. Modern research on trauma shows that living under constant threat of death creates permanent changes in brain chemistry. Sleep becomes fractured. Concentration suffers. Relationships strain under the weight of perpetual uncertainty. Now imagine experiencing this, not for months or years, but for generations. This was the inheritance of early Christianity. Fear passed down like family recipes. Some broke under the pressure. They were called the lapsi, the fallen ones, who offered sacrifice to pagan gods to save their lives. The church struggled with how to treat them. Were they traitors or trauma victims? Could they be forgiven, or were they permanently contaminated? These debates nearly split early Christianity apart, creating factions that lasted for centuries. Others found ways to resist without direct confrontation. They developed elaborate codes for identifying fellow believers. They created networks for hiding fugitives and supporting martyrs' families. They memorized entire books of scripture in case written texts were confiscated. They learned to pray in silence, to worship without gathering, to maintain faith without community support. The truly remarkable thing wasn't that some Christians compromised under pressure. It was that any of them held firm at all. Modern psychology struggles to explain how ordinary people, without special training or exceptional backgrounds, could choose agonizing death over simple ritual compliance. It defies everything we know about human survival instincts, yet they did it, repeatedly, consistently, across different cultures, social classes, and geographic regions. Slaves and senators, children and elderly, educated and illiterate, all demonstrated the same inexplicable willingness to die rather than deny their faith. Roman authorities kept expecting the movement to exhaust itself, to run out of volunteers for martyrdom. Instead, it kept growing. The irony was perfect. Rome, master of the known world, could conquer armies and topple kingdoms, but couldn't defeat a religion that refused to fight back. Every tool of imperial power, from legal intimidation to public torture, only strengthened what it was designed to destroy. The empire that prided itself on rational administration had encountered something that didn't respond to rational incentives. This wasn't just historical curiosity. This was the foundation upon which your entire religious tradition was built. Every comfortable church service, every peaceful prayer, every casual Bible reading exists because thousands of people you'll never know chose horrible deaths rather than abandon what you might take for granted. They didn't die for theology or doctrine or ecclesiastical authority. They died for the simple conviction that Jesus was Lord and Caesar wasn't. That God's kingdom mattered more than earthly survival. That some truths were worth more than life itself. It sounds noble in retrospect, but living it was pure terror. And this terror wasn't temporary. It lasted for centuries. Generation after generation of Christians lived and died under the shadow of imperial persecution. Children grew up knowing that following Jesus might cost them everything. Parents raised families while planning for orphaned grandchildren. Communities flourished while preparing for extinction. The psychological legacy of this trauma shaped Christianity in ways that persist today. The emphasis on suffering as spiritual discipline, the suspicion of worldly power and comfort, the expectation that true faith requires sacrifice, the deep conviction that persecution proves authenticity rather than disproves it. All of this flows directly from the experiences of those first-century believers who chose death over compromise. So when modern Christians complain about cultural opposition or legal restrictions, remember that their spiritual ancestors faced crucifixion, burning, and wild animals for the same basic beliefs. When contemporary believers worry about social acceptance or professional consequences, consider that early Christians expected their faith to result in literal torture. This isn't meant to minimize modern challenges or guilt contemporary believers into silence about their difficulties. It's simply to acknowledge the staggering courage of those who established the foundation upon which all subsequent Christian experience rests. They didn't know their sacrifice would eventually triumph. They couldn't see the coming conversion of Constantine or the Christianization of the empire. They died believing their cause was hopeless by any earthly measure. Yet they died anyway. And in doing so, they created something that outlasted the empire that killed them. Rome fell. Caesar's line ended. The gods who demanded their sacrifice were forgotten. But the faith they died for conquered the world that crucified its founder. That's the inheritance of every Christian who came after. Not just the theological content of the faith, but the blood-bought conviction that some things matter more than survival. That truth is worth dying for, that God's kingdom really is more substantial than earthly power. That martyrdom, however terrifying, is simply the final test of everything you claim to believe. They passed that test. In sewers and stadiums, in private homes and public squares, in moments of quiet courage and spectacular defiance. They proved that faith could survive anything Rome could devise to destroy it. They demonstrated that the gospel was more powerful than the empire. And they did it all while knowing that rescue wasn't coming, that justice wouldn't arrive in time, that their deaths would change nothing visible in their lifetime. They chose faithfulness over survival, conviction over compromise, eternal hope over temporal comfort. That's what real Christianity looked like before it became safe, legal, and socially acceptable. Before churches had budgets and denominations, had headquarters, and believers had constitutional protections. When following Jesus meant risking everything and gaining nothing but the promise that God would remember their sacrifice. Sleep well, knowing that your faith was purchased with the lives of people who never saw the Christianity you inherited. They died so you could believe in safety. They suffered so you could worship in comfort. They were forgotten so you could be remembered. The blood of martyrs really was the seed of the church. But seeds have to die before they can grow into something beautiful. And thousands upon thousands of first-century Christians planted themselves in Roman soil, trusting that God would bring forth life from their sacrifice. He did, but they never lived to see it. The years pass like drops of blood on stone. You've survived persecution, watched friends disappear into the darkness of Roman dungeons, buried children whose only crime was bearing the name of Christ. Your hair has gone grey, your hands bear the scars of labour and suffering, but your faith burns brighter than ever, because you've learned something the empire cannot understand. That suffering, when shared in love, becomes strength. You gather with the others in the pre-dawn darkness, just as you have for decades. But tonight feels different. The whispers speak of something stirring across the empire. Letters arrive from distant cities, carried by believers who've walked hundreds of miles just to share the news. Churches are growing. Not just surviving, but thriving. In Antioch, in Corinth, in places you can't even pronounce, the message spreads like wildfire through dry grass. The irony is breathtaking. Every crucifixion meant to terrorize has become a sermon. Every arrest has scattered believers like seeds on the wind. Every attempt to silence the church has only made its voice louder. The empire's own brutality has become the instrument of its defeat. You think of Marcus, the Roman soldier who used to guard your meetings. He'd stand there, stone-faced, watching as you shared bread and wine. Until one evening, tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. He'd been listening, learning, believing. Now he's one of you, baptized in the same river where so many others have died for their faith. The children who once hid behind their mother's robes now stand tall, reciting the words of Jesus with voices that carry across the caverns. They've grown up in the shadow of death, yet they speak of life with an authority that silences philosophers. They are the generation that will carry this message beyond the catacombs, beyond Rome itself. You remember the prophecy spoken by the apostles before they were martyred, that this gospel would reach the ends of the earth. At the time, it seemed impossible. How could a handful of frightened believers hiding in sewers challenge the might of Rome? But now you understand. The empire thought it was crushing rebellion. Instead, it was forging an army. The very stones of Rome cry out the names of the faithful. Every catacomb tells a story of love stronger than death. Every hidden symbol carved into walls speaks of hope that cannot be extinguished. The empire may rule the world above, but down here, in the depths, a different kingdom is rising. Your body is failing now. The years of hardship have taken their toll. But your spirit soars because you've seen the impossible become inevitable. You've watched a carpenter's message from an obscure province transform the heart of the greatest empire in history. Not through conquest, but through sacrifice. Not through violence, but through love. As you close your eyes for the final time, surrounded by brothers and sisters who will carry on the fight, you smile. Because you know something Nero never could, something the philosophers missed, something the empire will learn too late, that there are forces in this world more powerful than legions, that love, real love, the kind that dies for others, cannot be defeated by sword or fire or cross. The empire that seemed eternal will crumble into dust. Its eagles will fall, its Caesars will be forgotten, its glory will fade like morning mist. But this church, born in blood and nurtured in darkness, will endure, not because it was strong, but because it was faithful. Not because it conquered, but because it served. Your name will never be carved in marble or sung by poets. No statue will commemorate your sacrifice. But your legacy lives on in every act of love, every word of hope, every life laid down for others. You helped build something more lasting than pyramids, more beautiful than palaces, more powerful than empires. The first century church didn't just survive Rome, it outlived it. And somewhere in the darkness of the catacombs, if you listen carefully, you can still hear their voices, singing hymns of praise, whispering prayers of hope, declaring with their very existence that love wins, that faith endures, that even in the deepest darkness, light cannot be overcome. You wouldn't have lasted a day in a first century Roman church, but they lasted long enough to change the world forever.